Hello, and welcome to the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are continuing our book club style indie comic book deep dive. And this time it is Gospel by Will Morris from Image Comics. And as you heard in our intro episode, not a lot that you'll know Will Morris from. And the title does not give much away.
It really doesn't.
This was kind of a blind leap of faith for a lot of people who picked it up. And I think we'll probably start there with the artwork because that's certainly how I came to the book. I saw the cover and I was like, oh my God, that's beautiful.
Yeah, those covers by, the covers are they're not by Will Morris, we mentioned. They're by Vers. Still not certain how to pronounce that, but, whatever. They are phenomenal. And you know, in the, I read this in single issue, Mike. I don't know how.
I actually did as well. It's a rare one. I saw it was 1 in 5, and I was like, I already bought the first one. Even I can commit to 4 more single issues.
Yeah, and I think in the back of that first issue, there's a little note there from Will Morris saying that he was working on covers for Gospel when he went to, I think it was Edinburgh Comic Con, and he saw Vers work and was like, nope, I'm going to have this guy do it.
Yep.
You know, because and they are really, really beautiful. But yeah, you know, so this is one of your suggestions here. I had not heard of this book. I had not seen it before, but the thing that jumped out at me once I started reading was Will Morris's art style. The way he draws characters, his use of color, and I mean this in the best way. It feels like he's kind of aping Chris Samnee. And Chris Samnee is one of my favorite artists. Just incredible work, a ton of work at Marvel. He's got a couple creator-owned things going right now. Firepower with Robert Kirkman, and then his own book he does with his wife. It's an all-ages book called Joanna and the Unstoppable Monsters. But I think there's a very similar character design, and I think specifically facial work in terms of how Morris draws, and I see that in Samnee, and I recognize it. And I'm not saying that Samnee is the only one that does that, but he is my go-to for this style because I've read so many of his books, and I'm such a fan of his. So I like that. I like this kind of clean character style. There's not a lot of busy work there. It's very simple, small lines that create facial movement and facial expressions.
Yeah, and I was going to say the line work is not overdone. It's not super busy.
Yeah,
and some of these pages
it's still expressive. It's still very expressive.
No. You get everything you need.
100%.
And some of these pages, if you take away the color, just with your imagination, you can see kind of how Spartan or how sparse the design is.
Yeah. And I think that's great. You know, I started really reading comics in the late 80s, early 90s, and there's a whole lot of hatching and shading that's done by the artists and the inkers, to the point of, I think, ridiculously. And so, as we moved out of that style and we started seeing a little broader range, and seeing some simpler, cleaner, it's sparser design, but again, still as evocative is the stuff that I'm drawn to now and have been for a while. So seeing Morris' style here, that jumped out at me. And that said to me, I want to keep reading this, because I didn't know this guy, didn't know his style, but the art was enough there in those opening pages for me to say, I'm on board with how this stuff looks. I'm on board with the character work. So I can keep going in there. And so I'm glad you picked it. It's a new creator that I hadn't heard of before, but I really love his style. And I think the way he uses color here, and he's credited as artist and writer and everything, letter and everything like that,
with minor color assist,
which could be finishes, could be flattening. Who knows? That's a nebulous title as we discussed.
It's whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, it's whatever kind of help he may have needed.
Well, and let me just point out real quick, in defense of the 90s color, one of my biggest takeaways from the interview with Lee Loughridge, which if you didn't listen to that, go back and listen to that. Hilarious, entertaining. Maybe put headphones on if you're at work, because Lee's not just colorful in his design, but in his speech. But the limitations of printing in the 90s.
Yes.
Which is
yes,
why
yes.
you could not print certain colors. And so that's why it had to be busier and a little clunky and dense sometimes. Whereas now with modern printing,
fair.
when you look at Will Morris, it's like he's just got like a tapestry of beautiful watercoloring as the backdrop for a scene, which is like almost just a complete flex compared to what people were capable of printing.
That's fair. That's fair. I can concede to that. But still, you look back in the 90s art,
I know it's still hard to go back.
Even the line work is rough. But that was a style. That's the way everyone drew, and that's
right. If you wanted to get published,
yes,
that's how
you had to draw that way. Yeah, you couldn't break the mold then. But I'm so glad we live in an age now where so many different artists from different backgrounds and different eyes and different training can produce such a wide variety of books. And again, seeing the work that Will Morris does here, and just I think some of the gorgeous colors here, they're very vibrant, they're very bright, but they're not like basic primary colors. He's using different kind of tones, but he knows kind of when to use color to have it really kind of pop off the page. There's a reason why Matilda has this kind of turquoise tealish hair, so that kind of no matter what, your eyes always drawn to that on the page. They refer to her as being a peacock,
right.
Her characterization is such that she is always the center of attention because that's what she's striving to be. That's what she desires to be, the center of the story.
Which she fails to learn the lesson from the tale. But in I think issue 2, you get her backstory.
Yes.
And that is shaded in the same color as her hair.
Yes.
Which is, it's just a little stroke of like intentionality that is just so cool. The only thing not colored there is the golden hammer, the ring on her chest as a baby, and the red flag on the ship. Everything else is the color, some shade of her hair color.
Yeah, it's all kind of hued there. Yeah, no. No, but I think it works. It works so well. Whether he's kind of depending on the scene, whether it's he's casting an orangish, reddish hue over the entire page or entire set of panels, or it's maybe it's more of a blue or green kind of thing, or a yellow. He is setting the mood. I think perfectly well with the accents to the story as he's going along. I think it's really, really, I think it works really, really well.
Yeah. I think we'll probably keep going on the art more as we go.
Yeah.
Suffice it to say, the art was why I picked it up. And I had a friend who does not read comics. In the car with me, I was like, I need to run into the shop real quick and pick up my pull list. And they were looking around, saw the issue 1 of Gospel, not a comic reader, was like, oh, this is cool, I need this, and bought it. And I was like, nice. Okay, that's a pretty impressive for like first major publication from Will Morris. Again, the wisdom he had of scrapping his own covers and saying, oh wait, this Verse can deliver me the covers that I need.
There's someone that can better portray what I'm thinking and feeling about the story. That's especially since you've already written and drawn and colored and lettered the whole thing yourself on the inside.
And I think on that letter on the first issue, if I'm not mistaken, is like a watercolored sketch of what I assume was Will Morris's crack at the first cover. Maybe that's a draft of Verse.
Let me see. I think those were the four options that Verse had done.
Yes. Right.
So yeah.
And so you can see one of them is very close to the final product, but nowhere near what we ended up getting. So anyway, like the art will draw you in. If you find the story confusing now, like how would you rate the complexity of this story? We've done some really complicated books, and we've done some pretty straightforward in terms of story. I think it's pretty straightforward in that there's not that many characters. It's a pretty linear story.
Yeah.
However, if it were all set in the Reformation era and there were no modern version, modern jumping to the what's his name, Mr. Fisher,
Mm-hmm.
this would be like a 3 out of 10. With the Fisher thing, trying to understand that, I'm going to call it like a 6.5 or 7 out of 10 in terms of its complexity.
Yeah, I hesitate to call it a framing device because it's not used in every issue.
See, that's
we don't start with
and
it,
that was.
But
I have framing device written down and scratched out.
I had it in quotation marks. But those flash forward, whatever you want to call them, just the current day story, the modern day storyline, that is, I hesitate to put that with talking about the story because none of that is seemingly it's definitely not plot relevant, in terms of if you take those out there, you can follow the story of Matilda and Pitt all the way through and get everything about it. And I think any complexity that comes into that story is the historical context in which it's set in, and maybe your buy-in or your willingness or just how much you care about that era of English history, because if you don't care at all about that, you just read it and kind of it's just kind of whatever. If that's an era of time that is of interest of you, I think you are seeing some of the maybe some of the nuance of, I think especially of some of the ancillary characters in the story. Some of the other town folks, and you see how their lives are not being disrupted or even made better by the influx of the Reformation and things like that. I think some of those side characters, because obviously you have Matilda on one side, effectively you have Matilda on one side and Pitt on the other, right? That's right. Kind of how it's set up. Not so much as antagonists, but just showing two viewpoints. But if you look at the other people that are in the town in Rumstead, you can kind of start seeing how the ideas of reform are seeping their way in. So again, if that's something that's of interest to you, if that's a time frame, a period of history, which I know it's a period of history that people love to go back to in this country, Anglophiles, that's like that's an area that people love if you're so inclined. I think that doesn't add to the complexity to it, but I think it adds to the depth and the things that you as a reader may take out of it. I think my question on the historical aspect was like, how necessary was it to the story? Like, how much of an add was it to the storytelling to have that context there? Because I don't think it's in any way detracts from the story, but I'm not certain how much it adds to the reader unless that's something you're already interested in. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think it comes down to a lot of this is framed for me early on. Matilda says her objection in issue 1 to having an English Bible is that it robs simple folk of understanding. And the idea that, you're kind of rocking the boat because things are going pretty smoothly because everyone can agree on things because it's all coming from one source.
Yeah.
And prior to that, prior to the Continental Reformation and the English Reformation, the Bible said whatever Rome said it said.
Yeah.
If you were lucky, there would be one Bible per town chained to a pulpit written in Latin with one qualified person to read Latin.
Yeah.
And that certainly made governing easier. Granted, I think, any devout religious person would tell you the purpose of that text was not to govern. It's been a misuse of the text all along. But I think that's some of the significance to it it's if you made this in a modern day setting, it would be about how the internet robs simple folk of their understanding, because
that
there used to be a definitive textbook for everything, and now people just go find alternate facts for whatever they want. Post-Reformation, the hilarious thing about the Reformation was as soon as the Bible left Latin, Greek, Hebrew, whatever, into whatever language, all of a sudden every country had their own version of Christianity. Germans had Lutherans, the Scots had Presbyterians, Anglicans, emerged from England. The Swiss had their own, the Dutch had their own. And it was like, now what are the chances that theologically this is necessary, that everyone who speaks a different language has to have their own version of the faith? And it shows how the faith was being co-opted to, be a prop for political power, and also to forge a national identity using what was meant to be an international thing. So I think that's the interesting thing. It would feel, I think, a little too on the nose to make it so modern day that it's about the internet. And we haven't really seen where that ends yet.
We're in the middle of that right now.
So I think throwing it back 500 years to an era that's kind of caricaturized in a lot of telling, I think it's an era that is either completely vilified or it's hagiographic, where people just glorify it, and it's like, oh, all these perfect people throwing off the evil oppression of the Roman Church or whatever. It's like, in reality, everybody had pretty dirty hands involved with all of this stuff.
Well, yeah, and I think that's isn't that in the note in the very beginning here, right? Hold on, I gotta.
Oh yeah, at the beginning
of issue one, right?
There's imported in the trade because that's officially part of it.
Yeah,
England, 1538. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and they talk about how the idea of going back to Henry VIII or whatnot, and then how Thomas Cromwell was like, hey, the words he uses here, Thomas Cromwell seized the opportunity, as in the idea of these were things he already wanted to do, and now he had an excuse, meaning he had just as much of an agenda as what Rome already had. Rome's agenda and the Pope's agenda. So that the Church of England isn't it's not some pure idea of Reformation. Is that he still had things he wanted to accomplish that he just couldn't get done. He couldn't implement, he couldn't do. And so, this was an opportunity for him. So it's not about one side being right, one side being wrong, one side being perfect, and one side being all flawed. It's that, there are simply just all shades of gray. And I think you're right when we look back specifically on this era that,
I've heard it
we get lost in
spun
that.
two ways. So like in my AP Euro class, we were told the Episcopal Anglican Church only exists because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce.
Yeah.
And it's a little simplistic and a little cynical.
That's a little reductive. Yeah. It's not entirely wrong.
No. It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
And then when I was talking to, I kind of made a flippant comment about that when I was 18 or 19, and I met someone. I had a religious studies professor at University of Cincinnati that was an Episcopal priest, super cool guy, insisted on moving class outdoors every day so he could smoke his pipe while he lectured.
Classic.
And so I made some ignorant 18-year-old flippant remark about, how his church only exists because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce. And his version of it, which, he wasn't like a dogmatic defender. He was like a very open-minded guy. But he said, actually, there were a lot of like theologians who really wanted theological independence from Rome, and they played King Henry. When the opportunity arose, they said, hey, look, if you had your own church, by the way, we have all these capable theologians here. If you had your own church, I think we could probably make it work theologically for you to have a divorce.
Yeah.
And King Henry's like, okay, great, do that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really doubt it was that simple. But I think there were probably theologians longing for political freedom.
Yeah.
That were opportunistic, and King Henry VIII longing for political freedom, because Rome's influence was not merely religious. So anyway,
I think both those angles, again, both those are moderately reductive in this, that it's not quite as simple as one or the other, but that it's all about it's just finding that was the opening. however it came by, that was the opening for.
And almost
for
every
the split.
historical event is some cocktail of,
Yeah.
pure motives and naive motives and political power grabs and impure motives. I don't think there's any event in history that hasn't had the fusion of all those things in the melting pot. And some of them are a little skewed a little more to one or the other. Some of them are insanely naive, even though there are other things mixed in, and other of them are just outright evil motives where they found a few decent sounding excuses. But the second sentence there says a period of new technology, of progress colliding with old ways of haves and have-nots. That's where I read like, okay, I'm going to track this as a parallel with, we're 20 years into this new technology that has corroded our, political system and, our education system. And as we're recording this,
society in general, basically.
Yeah. We're basically, we're starting the new school year, and some states are like rewriting textbooks now, because that's something they can do. They have scourged the internet to find, alternate versions of history and, fake universities with alternate narratives of, slavery and things like that. And they're like, oh, well, we'll just cite this source, and now we can say some people say this. So I think it's the new kind of floodgate, which is the same thing, smaller scale, when the printing press was invented.
Yeah.
You went from a few printed documents in the world to printed documents in every home.
Yeah.
And that's not much different than
but it goes with every step along the way in terms of how media is consumed, whether it's from a printing press to radio to television to the internet. There are moments surrounded, and obviously a lot of those are compressed now in time-wise, but there's anytime you can reach more people with whatever it is you're saying or doing, that can help lay the groundwork for change. Be it good change, be it good or bad. It can go either way.
Most of those are introduced for some official mode of communication, and then eventually
something happens. There's an event happens,
and scatological stuff starts to get, and it starts to drown out everything, and then it it becomes up to the user to discern how to handle new information and things.
But I think so setting the story there. So my question going back to being the idea of how additive is it to the story? Is it more than just context? And I think, again, if this is not something, a particular area of history you're interested in, like personally, I'm not. Like I don't care about English history, like a lot of people in this country do. Like surprising, I know. I'm not an Anglophile, but I find it interesting the choice to set this when it is, because of the specific time and references and things that Will Morris can use in his story. That again, I don't think they're wasteful. I don't think they're burdensome. Like I don't think it ladens the story with anything that it can't handle. But I also think there's a way to read the story where when you hit some of those points, you can almost like skip past them. If you just want to read what's happening with Matilda and Pin in the town.
Sure, yeah. So I don't find the context, like I wouldn't pick up the story because it was set in 16th century England. Like, I don't find that interesting.
Okay, that's a good way to frame it. Yeah, is if someone is interested in this period of English history, is this a story that would be for them?
Right. And the
answer is probably no.
Reason, by the way, that I think one of the reasons that I never got into Stranger Things, because it seemed like the main appeal for it was nostalgia for 80s, and I don't feel nostalgic for the 80s. Yeah. I was born in the mid 80s and don't have many memories of the 80s. I'm extremely nostalgic for the 90s, which makes me things that bank on 90s nostalgia now, which are increasingly popular. Like Captain Marvel got a whole extra star rating from me because it was 90s nostalgia, and they leaned hard into it. Whereas like, I'm like, was Stranger Things early on interesting apart from the 80s nostalgia. Like, yeah, maybe if that's your genre, but I felt like they were kind of gilding the lily a bit with the 80s nostalgia. And it was like, really come in for, the kids on bike premise, the 80s nostalgia, and we'll figure out a compelling story once we have your attention.
I think the story is compelling. You're not wrong about the idea of Stranger Things leaning hard into that. I think this is one of those interesting times where our relatively small age gap is huge.
Oh yeah.
Because I think we're only like maybe 4 years apart, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably.
Yeah. So there's a very small
but
gap
you have
there.
Memories in the 80s.
I have more.
My earliest memory I can remember is the 1990 World Series. And I don't have distinct memories. I just remember being in the room with it on TV and the excitement. But I can't. I couldn't tell you a play that happened in the game.
Yeah.
I can that's fall of 90.
Yeah, I can recite that series from heart because I'm a little. Again, so again, that's one of those parts there where, when you lead hard into that era, that is the selling point. That is, come in for this, and then we'll give you a compelling story. I think Stranger Things is a compelling story there, even if they do tread too heavily. I think they do. Two things can be true. They do tread too heavily on the nostalgia and the hey, look, the 80s stuff, but they've also, in general, produced a very compelling story. So with Gospel, just going back there, saying that if you're interested in this time period, if you're interested in the time of Henry VIII and the Reformation, this is not a story you would go and seek out because it's not about that. Right? It's just set in that time frame. That's why I think it just gives added context to the story, and some smaller details you can pick up as you're reading, but it's not necessary to the story. This could be set really at any time because ultimately, what's it about? It's about the idea of, I guess, like, what is faith? A question there. What's your place kind of in the world relative to faith in terms of what you believe? And that can be set in any time, I guess, because this is, I guess, one of the recurring themes of our show is the idea of stories and the stories we tell, because this is a book where the characters are obsessed with story. At least Matilda is obsessed with story because she wants to inspire, she wants to lead. And I mean, every aspect of this is about the story. You think about, Father.
No. I agree with you, but I would say the purpose of this series has nothing to do with faith. It's a commentary about the meaning of stories, similar to the Unwritten. And I think his premise that's right. He's using faith in that way. Yeah. But the first interaction with Mr. Fisher, he says every storyteller has their purpose, which I find fascinating because, one, we never quite find out what Mr. Fisher's purpose is in telling his stories. Yes. And he's actually the one narrating all of the Matilda and Pitt story. So whatever story we're hearing about them is filtered through Mr. Fisher's purpose. And the first question I'll be asking Will Morris in our forthcoming interview is, you said every storyteller has a purpose. Yeah. What's your purpose in telling this story? Yeah. So I think the layers, like the kind of the meta layers of that statement, that on the reread, that filtered the way I read everything after it. Sure. I was like, okay, so Matilda is guilty in multiple issues here of racketeering. She's, she is. She's creating crimes so that she can go solve them, whether it's letting this little pig in a pottery shop or paying someone to start a small contained fire in the church, only to have someone beat her to it because there's apparently racketeering's just in right now. Yeah. But she's trying to create a system where, and hilariously, she's trying to create a story for her to be the hero of. The only time she doesn't try to create the story is when she defeats the stalker, which is like, should be the story that she then, headlines the rest of her life. Yeah. Pitt is always trying to embellish stories because his purpose as a storyteller, he doesn't really seem concerned about like who he's making a hero, who he's making a villain. He's kind of a bard. His job is storytelling. Yeah. He needs the best story because that's his product. Yeah. So he's like a publisher. He doesn't really care about who's getting credit as a writer, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, what does this do for the Reformation, anything like that. He's kind of a hired gun. He wants the best version of a story.
He's just trying to entertain so he can get some money.
He's trying to sell pages. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. He's getting clicks.
Yes, exactly. So to me, it's all about every storyteller has a purpose. Matilda has a selfish one. Pitt has a selfish one. Presumably, the old man has a selfish one. He actually accuses all of this stems from the neighbors have some complaint about Mr. Fisher, presumably that his house is run down, decrepit, filled with crap, or that he's a curmudgeon or something like that. Mm-hmm. He says, well, the neighbors have their purpose. Basically, they want to oust me so they can have my property and have someone, come gentrify it or something like that. So he accuses them of having their motive for telling their story. Presumably, his motive is something to oppose the neighbors.
Yeah. Which I would assume is staying in his house.
Right. He wants to stay there.
Yeah. Not getting shipped to a retirement home.
Or social services. But he's actually shown a little bit more of his hand than he might realize in sharing that. So to me, it's all about it's all about who controls the narrative. Yeah. And it's about what their purpose is. And it's kind of unmasking everyone's purpose. Like no one has pure intent. They're not just trying to history is not about just relaying facts. Yeah. And neither is news. Yeah. And that's, the two biggest myths. Like when I was taught history, perhaps this is how you have to teach it to children in elementary school, but you teach it as here's a recitation of the facts. This is what happened.
Yeah.
Since then, the rest of my life, history has been cleaning up bad information I got, about, pilgrims and indigenous people. And,
about literally everything you learned in history class.
Literally everything I learned, the ugly side of the American Revolution and all of this stuff. And I'm not a big history buff, by the way. I go out of my way to try to clean up bad information that I might have, because those bad informations are actually narratives that give you a sense of self and identity within a culture, within a people group, anything like that. And anything that you're grossly misinformed about will lead to a very serious distortion in your self-perception. So history is worth relearning on those terms. But by itself, I'm 100% with you. If I never have to hear a story, true or false, about the 16th century English front, that's totally fine with me. I will say much later Victorian era, I'm a huge fan of Dickens, but I would say I'm a fan of Dickens despite the English setting. I don't care that it's in England. I like the way he draws characters, which is almost cartoonish.
Sure.
Which is funny for a guy who spills so much ink writing to do broad stroke caricatures and archetypes for everything he does. I just find it endearing and amusing, but not because of its Englishness.
So Dickens and the way he writes could have been writing about any characters in any time in any place.
Yeah,
as long
as
that
I wish he would have.
Right.
Yeah. Which is Shakespeare did not constrain himself to, he wrote the Henrys, yes, but he also wrote Roman history. He was I can write in our context, I can rewrite our history in an amusing way, or I can just borrow from other cultures and times and places and write those things. So if I want to write about Caesar, I'll write about Caesar.
Sure. So no, I think you're absolutely right. In terms of what the major theme, major motif, major idea presented here in gospel. And I do think something that you and I were talking about, I think before we started recording a little bit, the idea that Morris doesn't come down on either side, on any side.
He's a mediator.
Yeah. As you say, he's going out of his way to expose all the storytellers and show what their sides are, what their motives are, with the exception of Mr. Fisher. He's the one mystery, but everyone else, why Pitt believes what he does and why his quasi girlfriend Jennifer believes what she does. You understand why Matilda believes what she does because you understand what Father Nicholas believes what he does. And so you see all of that there. And so it's laid bare for the reader to understand that where everyone's viewpoint is, at least in the past, quote unquote, story, you see everyone's motive there. So he's not trying to say these people are right, these people are wrong, in terms of what their perspective is. Maybe their specific actions you can judge them on.
Sure.
You know, like Father Nicholas is definitely meant to be the bad guy, the quote unquote capital B bad guy. But
given what everyone is doing, he is at least sympathetic in that every storyteller has their purpose, and that's levels the playing field.
What I'm trying to get across there, is that you understand where he's coming from in terms of why he would be against the idea of Reformation. Now, the steps he takes to combat that, you can argue with and say that you've gone too far, you did too much. But the stance of being anti-Reformation, you can at least understand where he's coming from there. And so Morris shows all of this and gives the reader all of this perspective on all the stories. Again, except for Mr. Fisher, which I guess maybe moves us to talking about maybe a little more in detail what we think about this modern setting here.
It struck me as very, very strange the first time I read it. It felt unnecessary. I thought it was going to be like the framing device in the Flintstones.
Okay, this was going to be my exact question. It doesn't appear at the beginning. So when you open the book up, the first thing is the
someone feel like telling quite a bait and switch with the front cover.
Yeah,
and then jumping into a modern cottage.
Yes. So the book starts out with someone telling or retelling one of Pitt's stories of Matilda, right? About the giant boar and all that. And you're working your way through, and you're set in this time frame, this 16th century England. And then there's a quasi pause in the story and then hard cut. And now we're in a modern day setting. And what was your thought when you first got to those pages? I think I cut you off there. You were saying like that Flintstones.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be like
framing.
I thought it was going to be. I feel bad saying this because we're going to have him on the podcast, but this is my apology.
Okay.
Because I underestimated him. I thought it was going to be like, for the sake of doing it, we're going to add this extra dimension, to make it, feel like just here's another piece of texture for the sake of it. It's not really adding anything to the story. And I kind of thought it didn't the first time I read the entire book. I kind of thought it seems like it was more or less the same story, whether you had that framing device or not. I feel differently after a reread.
Okay. That's interesting. I felt that way until the very end, until that last page reveal, which we'll get to in a second here.
But the last page confused the hell out of me.
Well, yeah, it confused me. It confused the hell out of me the first time I read it. And then on rereads, it confused me in a better way. But we'll get to that in a second here. What I'm wondering is, because as I was reading it, and every time I went back to it, initially it was like, okay, we're going back and doing this again. This is probably going to be important. Were you trying to figure out who Mr. Fisher might have been as you were reading? Because that as I was going through that became maybe not a focal point, but it became a thing of emphasis for me as I'm going through, as I'm trying to reading the very first time through. So not knowing what the story was and how it was going to play out, I started thinking about who Mr. Fisher was or might have been, and it was going back and forth of being like, is he, and tracking a number of different things here, knowing that one of our lead characters, Pitt, is a bard. So his whole idea is telling stories. And Matilda is this person who's obsessed with having her story being told. And so is this a guy who is a descendant of someone and these stories have been passed down through the generations? Is he some immortal being? Whatever it is. But that became a focus for me. Well, that was the point to the point where I wasn't lost or ignoring the main story, like the actual beats of what Pitt and Matilda were doing.
No, but if he is one of those people, then that is the main story. So that's like, you say you're distracted by it, but it's a very distracting premise.
Yeah, because I'm trying to think ahead. I'm trying to see how clever I think Will Morris is or might be, and I'm projecting that onto him because I'm reading this thinking, okay, this is going to be important. Like, what? It's one thing if the book had opened page 1 in the modern day world. Again, like the Flintstones, there we start there, and it is literally a framing device beginning and end. It's another thing to go a handful of pages and then introduce it. Get us into our story back in time and then jump into the modern day story. That's you're sending a different kind of message there. And so, yeah, the first time through, I was preoccupied. I mean, maybe it's a little strong there, but I had an emphasis on trying to figure out who he was and his relationship to the story, which is why
kind of masterful that in issues 2 and 4, it's not even there.
Yeah. You don't return to it.
Right.
But then when you do eventually come back to it, the Soze worker, Gita there, it basically cuts back. The first time we cut back, and it appears she's dozed off at some point, meaning, again, implying that everything you've been reading is Mr. Fisher storytelling. That Gita is us here, that she is
Iron Man 3 framing device.
Yeah. She is learning the story at the same rate we are, Right. So even when they're not on panel, not on page, the story is being relayed. And so, yeah, that was a preoccupation for me as I was reading it the first time, which gets us to the final 2 pages there, specifically that last page. Is I think something that you and I wanted to get into here, which is why initially I say it was confusing at first, because again, up until this final page, I'm trying to figure out who Mr. Fisher is. And I am in some ways expecting an answer, or at least I'm anticipating an answer.
Well, right? Yes. Okay. So,
and then when I don't get one, and instead I get this montage of artifacts, I am left in a confused state. Yeah. But then again, so
it broke my brain a little bit.
It did the first time through,
and in kind of a pleasant way, because I felt like, oh, here he goes. He's going to tie all up with a bow. And instead you get this enigmatic scatter shot at this last page. And then it says, you flip the page and it says, thanks for reading my story. I'm like, what? No. You owe me at least one more panel. Okay. So you go issue 1. He says, this place is my imagination, my soul would be lost without it. And she says, well, so far you've not given much to go on. You don't recall a next of kin, your date of birth, or even when you settled here. Perhaps you could tell me your earliest memory. He says, oh, memory is not a thing to be relied upon. It stands as proud as the cliffs that line this cove. But those very same cliffs have eroded by time and the elements to the point where they wouldn't recognize themselves. She is clearly very irritated with all the misdirection and rerouting. She says, well, Mr. Fisher, what can you tell me? And he says, the truth of my situation. I have another story. It'll give you everything that you need to know. And that he returns to that line right before that last page. It's everything you need to know. Yeah. And I find it interesting that despite there's nothing about Matilda that makes her a great protagonist, and I'm not even sure you can call her the protagonist because technically Mr. Fisher is the protagonist. And it's I guess his story, his memory. But if anything, I would say,
well, again,
he's a descendant of Matilda because he's the one trying to keep her story alive. Despite him saying like, oh, she's been replaced in the official history of this time and place. But here's the thing. This is the fundamental question for me of this story. Is this a fantasy? Is there anything supernatural at all happening? Was there actually a ghost of Rumpus? Because
they're actually a giant.
Right. Most of these things are kind of demythologized as we go through it, and the parts that aren't. So it's like, is he extremely old? Is he immortal? Well, that would make it, kind of mythic in and of itself. I don't think he is. I think he's just an old man who, it's kind of like the movie Big Fish, where the old man prefers the mythologized version of his own history. And his son becomes a journalist because he's so sick of his dad's tall tales for everything. And then when his father's passing away, he realizes like, oh, these tall tales do communicate the essence of who he was, and they're better versions. Like, this is just good storytelling, and this actually reveals more about his character, even though it's not factually correct. And so I think Big Fish is the comp I was thinking of.
All right.
Do you remember that movie? Did you ever see it?
Oh, yeah. No. I think it's the idea that your life is less about the things that happen and more about the person you are. And so, like you're saying,
right,
the tall
characters
tales,
you became and interact with.
Those stories you tell, if you understand them to be stories, that can tell you more about the person than the actual beat by beat history of them, because the essence of who they are comes across in those stories. You get to know who the person is and what was important to them. So I think that is an interesting comp here. And
so here's but do you take any of this to have any fantasy supernatural element at all to the book? At this point, I think it's been pried away from me, but I would have said, oh yeah, they believed that this stuff happened in a kind of mythological way back then. And now I'm like, after multiple rereads, I don't think anyone in the story believes any of that happened that way.
No, I don't think so. So you think Mr. Fisher is a descendant of someone in the town, probably Matilda, right?
Yeah, if anything. Otherwise,
could he be like the descendant of like Pitt and Jennifer?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't know why he'd be telling such a sympathetic story for Matilda at that point.
Well, I think there's still connection there, but between Pitt and Matilda there, and the idea of being the storyteller would obviously that's a task that would have fallen to Pitt, not Matilda. Matilda wants to be mythologized, but she's not the one actually doing it. She's not the one actually telling the tale, know? Right. So the idea of telling the tale, telling the story, and also it would fit then the idea of Matilda constantly badgering Pitt about telling people of her adventures,
Right.
And then so now if this were some descendant of Pitt, that this story of Matilda has been now passed down, that this is the one Matilda story, forget all the other ones that she was trying to, set up and manufacture. This is the real one. And this is the one that survives. Now I'm not saying I think that's who Mr. Fisher is. I on one of my rereads of this, what I mentioned to you before we started recording, I had a Usual Suspects Keyser Soze moment.
Yeah, you had a great comp there.
Which spoilers for a nearly 30-year-old movie now, because we're getting close
that's
to
officially been canceled anyway.
This is true. But the idea of right at the end on that last page, after Mr. Fisher delivers that line again when he said, "I said the story will tell you everything you need to know," and you see Geeta she puts her pen, she bites it back for pen, she looks around the room, and we get these close-ups of all these things here. We got the boar's head, the framed color picture too. I assume because
very strange. Right? Yeah,
the framed color picture,
the most confusing panel in any book we've read this year.
Well, it's a framed color picture of the characters that we, the reader, recognize as Matilda and Pitt.
Right.
Then there's a black and white photo of a house on. I guess maybe that's the church or something. That the cottage is there. Then there looks like what to be a tarot deck. Tarot deck. There is the headpiece for the madam of one of the guilds. Right. There's a sword.
Lady Turwit.
Thank you. There's a sword there. There is the bust. I believe that's the bust of Saint Rumpus.
Yeah.
Right.
Decapitated.
That we see earlier. There is the kind of wrought iron goat head, which is the symbol of the devil that Father Nicholas uses. There is a marionette puppet that very much looks like the Stalker character, the assassin. She was dressed and she moved very puppet-like, very, very, very agile and all that. There is the hammer, it's a physical hammer that obviously was this mythological Saint Rumpus hammer. And then finally there is a card or something or whatever it is that says "To thine own self be true," which is the inscription, the engraving that's on the ring that was left with Matilda, like her one lone possession she had before her life in the church. And so Gita is seeing all these elements here. And again, it's like the end of Usual Suspects when Chaz Palminteri he's drinking his coffee and he's looking around the bulletin board and he's seeing all the little things from the story and knowing and not knowing if the events were true and just the names were made up. He has no idea, but he's seeing everything on the bulletin board, right down to Kobayashi on the broken coffee cup after he drops it. So it's like putting all the pieces together and thinking, wait, has everything I've just been told a complete fabrication of the things I see in this room, and is that the truth of the story there? And we don't get a resolution there, but I think the implication is that Gita looks around the house, looks on the room, sees all these things. She makes the connection back to the story that Mr. Fisher just told her. And as she says, "Thank you, Mr. Fisher. I think I now understand what this place means to you," And so there's now an implicit understanding between the two of them. And it's almost, at least in her mind, in character, it feels like it's irrelevant as to whether or not the story is real, quote unquote, or made up.
Yeah, I think that's what gives me the big fish comp.
Yes,
the idea that broke my brain with the Keyser Soze thing.
Yeah.
Of like, if this is a Keyser Soze thing, and she just figured out like he's just making this all up. He's a crazy old man.
Yeah,
and he's just wasting my time. She's gonna be back to like kick him out of the home and take him to a nursing home.
I disagree. I think it works either way. If she understands now that whole tale she was just told, and that it's all a fabrication from this man's mind, I think the way I read it is she sees value in that. Because again, go back to their first interaction when he talks about what this house is, what this cottage is. He says this cottage is his imagination, right?
Right.
So the idea that everything in here, this is him. And the stories, whether they're real or fabricated by him or someone else, whether they're passed down or he made them up 5 minutes ago, this is who he is as a storyteller. And all these artifacts, all these relics here, again, whether they even are artifacts and relics, they all make up the person that he is. And I think the way I read it and the way I read it on rereads, having this kind of different perspective on it, is that she understands that that's important to him, and then she would then not be taking that away from her.
Okay, and so I think it's a blend of the Keyser Soze Big Fish.
Yeah, I think so, because I think the very last panel when she says, she's kind of on the bookshelf or whatever, she's holding the card that says "To thy own self be true," and she says, "I'll be sure to check back in on you soon. Save me a fresh tea bag, will you?" And the way I read that is she would come back and visit him again and get another story.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's the positive way to do it. I thought, how lettering in comics frequently will bold one word in every bubble.
Yeah.
I would really like to see them bold the word fresh, because it really grossed me out.
Oh, he was drawing them out.
She had to go pick which one to reuse.
Yeah.
For tea. Okay, so here's the thing that lends credibility to he's looking around making it up as he goes. To thine own self be true.
Sorry. Or at least
had made it up at some point.
Yeah. Maybe not on the spot, but he had made it up at some point. Yeah.
Yes. To thine own self be true. Quote from Hamlet. Hamlet written between 1599 and 1601. The events of this story set in 1583. Before Hamlet, Matilda's born sometime before then with a ring with a Shakespeare quote on it. Not likely. That to me seems like a little bit of retconning from him to use that quote that he really likes. It's also what he's doing by telling the story. He's being true to himself.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person he is. And he's inserted this thing around him into the story, even though it's a little anachronistic. I mean, and as far as anachronism goes in storytelling, he's off by like 20, 30 years. That's not bad. But it is one of those things where it's like, that's probably a pretty damning clue in favor of this not being a true account.
Yeah, sure. I guess we also haven't discussed and we didn't even talk about this in the pre-show either, the pre-planning. The name of the comic, Gospel.
Oh yeah, geez.
You have
it never comes up, right? I mean,
that's the thing. It never comes up specifically. It's never addressed. I don't even think they say the word gospel, not even reference to the Bible. Like there are times when Father Nicholas he's quoting Bible verses in response to like Matilda and Pitt when they're children to teach them lessons and things like that. I don't even think they say the word gospel. But what do you make of that in terms of the context and the meaning of what that word is? Whether we're talking like gospel lowercase g or the gospels capital G. So you're someone obviously who has more actual academic study of religious and religious texts than I do. Sure. So what do you make of that in context of this story and the idea of the retelling of tales?
I'm embarrassed to say that I had not given it any thought at all. It's just like it kind of reeled me in to the story, and then I was just like in it trying to figure out the story, and I wasn't zooming out. I would assume it's gospel lowercase g. Well, in a sense that it's like this is how things get mythologized, and the truth they convey is more important than the facts of what actual events, is being. Sure. Yeah, so it's like, it's like. People go through, all these stories, whether it's Jonah or Job or whatever, and it's like, are these factual accounts? And I think most people are like, it doesn't really matter if it's factual accounts. What was it trying to convey to the people it was being told to, and what can we learn from that?
Don't do that to the Creation Museum people.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
don't get me started.
Sorry.
That's true.
Wrong tangent. My bad.
No.
Just going for the joke there. Didn't mean to send you over the edge. But
It's Ken Ham, by the way, in case people are.
No relation. No relation to me.
No, it doesn't do you any favors on the pronunciation of your last name either.
It really doesn't. No.
But for those who live outside of the greater Cincinnati area, you may be spared from knowing about the Creation Museum and the Ark encounter or whatever it is. It's all stuff in Kentucky that is too close for comfort geographically and in terms of their religious affiliation. Anyway, it is a group of like hyper literal.
The TLDR is they believe the Bible is 100% fact. Every word of it is fact true. There's no interpretation. So
the Earth is 6,000 years old. It's whatever. Yeah, it's that stuff that no one for the 2,000-year history of Christianity has believed until these people in the late 20th century came along and said, no, we need to believe all of this stuff as a scientific textbook. And it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's no allegory, there's no parallel, there's no meaning, there's no interpretation. This is exactly what happened. So, but again, the idea of how the vast majority of people view religious texts is the idea of these are representations of things that happened, Again, right. I think, and I understand in some circles of religious people that'd be controversial, but the way I've always understood religion is that, we are conveying ideas. We're conveying and
I think
the thoughts and the meaning behind this is what we're intended to learn from this, not retell you what happened.
I think they would say that there are from that we do derive truths. And there may even be necessary facts, but we're not in the business of
delineating
telling. Right? We're not writing a history book. We're not writing a science book. This is its own genre of thing, and it's a genre that has fallen out of style in the post-Enlightenment era, and so everyone has tried to treat a 2,000+ year old religious text as if it were an Enlightenment era liberal arts study.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I think is interesting here is we have the phrase in modern parlance, gospel truth.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how far that goes back, but that's supposed to convey something that's unquestionably true, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Whether it's I'm asking,
Yeah,
I don't
my
think
understanding of the phrase is yes.
I don't
the
think it's
gospel
vernacular
truth.
that I use, but yeah, I think that means which is whenever that phrase was introduced, either
And
tongue
that's
in cheek or a hilarious juxtaposition,
yeah.
saying like, "Oh, it's gospel truth," and it's like, is that a phrase from someone who took the gospels and scripture as kind of like mythological truth, meaning it conveys a bigger truth than the mere story itself, or is this someone who was being hyper literal and thinks these are all factual conveyances? So
no,
it's very interesting.
We could probably look it up, but my understanding of that term, I always viewed it as that's capital G gospel truth, as in specific reference to the Bible and the idea that this is undeniable. This is the gospel truth, or this is the truth as it's written, as it's accepted. So that's how I always
Right,
have always
the canonical truth. Yeah.
Yes, I've always understood it to be that way. So yeah, it had origins back in a religious sense or a religious context. That you have to understand. You have to know what the Gospels are. Understanding what that was from a Christian standpoint, to understand the meaning of what that is. I think it's been diluted now, but I still think the phrase holds, as whenever you hear it meant saying that this is what is. This is what it actually is. This is the truth.
It sounds like in a cop show, they're interrogating someone and they ask them like, is that true? And they say, well, that's the gospel truth. It's like, that it's just that's how it's used. By the way, the word gospel just means good news. Is a bigger term than what Christianity,
which is why I'm trying to delineate again between lowercase g, capital G gospel.
Right.
In my mind, refers to the books from the Bible, but the idea of.
But I don't think he's conveying a particular piece of anything that he would consider to be like good news here. He's not imparting a belief system of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's using it in more of like the specific gospel truth type of way. But he's tongue in cheek about it because he's saying this old man is telling a true story, which, by the way, issue 1, jumping all the way back, before he dives into this, she said, what can you tell me? And he said, the truth of my situation. And he believes this story he's telling is the truest thing he can say about himself. What does it say about himself? Yeah, I don't know 100%.
Exactly. What is the truth? Is the truth the events of the story? Having reread it
pretty inconsequential.
Exactly. Yeah. Having reread it a couple times and taking into context that final page and that montage of close-up panels, I don't think his truth is the events of the story. But however, I think the reader, us, and in this case, the listener, Gita, are supposed to initially think that his truth is the story, is the event of the story. But I think when we get to the end and the way that I read it now, and I think it's the realization that Gita has, is that his truth isn't the event of the story. His truth is the story, the telling of the story.
Right.
That's what's important. And that's what makes him who he is. That's what makes this house, this cottage, what it is, and why it's important. And that's what she sees in all these artifacts, all these things that are elements of the story, that the truth is the story, not what happens in the story. And that's where I land on now, again, having reread this a handful of times and gotten past that initial confusion of that first read of when, I have my own set of expectations and anticipated endings based on other stories that I had read. Once I got past that and went back in the story for what I believed it was on its own, that's what I've come to, is that the story and the telling of the story is important. What happens in the story is less so.
Right. And I think cleverly the story tips its hand. By the way, this is why I suggested the book, because I have such unsettled feelings about it that I think you can't help but discuss this book. Like, I don't think you could just sit down and read the 5 issues and then just be like, okay, I'm done with that. Like, it begs to be reread. It begs to be discussed because there's so much ambiguity.
And that comes from the Mr. Fisher part of it. If that didn't exist and it was just the tale of Pitt and Matilda and Father Nicholas and finding the hammer
trite story
and defeating the devil, it would just be whatever. But that added spice of the modern day look back is what makes it interesting. I agree with that entirely.
Yeah, and I think he tips his hand to what he's doing a little bit when Matilda finds out there's no such thing as the magic hammer.
Yeah.
There's just this cave full of hammers.
Yeah.
Whichever one you use is the magic one.
Yes.
Yeah. Whichever one you do a magic thing with becomes the magic hammer, which to me reminds me of, I'm going to butcher the name. Is it Glitter Spar? Is that the name of Tommy Taylor's wand?
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And when he loses the wand and Wilson's like, screw it. Who cares about that? Just pick up anything and make it Glitter Spar. He was like, I'm trying to figure out what's happening here, and you're giving me nonsensical answers.
Yeah, well, it's the idea.
Wilson Taylor vibes.
Yeah, definitely. It was the idea that in the unwritten, the story was so powerful that it was the idea of Glitter Spar. So it could be a $5 piece of cheap plastic toy. Didn't have to be anything special. Is that the idea of Glitter Spar and the knowledge of it made this thing powerful and important. And so, here in this cave, when it's just a whole bunch of hammers, the important thing the important thing is picking up, choosing one, and using it. That made it important, not being the hammer. It was just, it's almost the act of using it, the willingness, the desire to use it for some level of good, that imbued the hammer with its magical abilities, magical properties. The person did that by their intent and their desire, not because the thing is inherently important or magical.
Yeah, well, and in the immortal words of Anthony Hopkins, this could be Asgard.
Yeah,
like Asgard's a people, not a place. And that was the beautiful thing in Ragnarok is when Thor realizes I'm the king of this people wherever they are. Yeah. That's the kingdom. It doesn't have to be tied to this one specific place. Yeah. And he kind of mythologizes Asgard in the same way that this hammer of Rumpus is mythologized, in the same way that Mr. Fisher is mythologizing all of his personal possessions.
Yeah. And I think it goes to the idea of what's more important, the actual thing or the idea of the thing. And I think that translates to what's more important, the events of the story being true or just the idea of the story being told, and I think the one clear answer that I get out of this is that Will Morris falls on the side of the idea of the story is important, not the actual events, not the actual thing, not the what you can prove truth, the physical thing you can hold and touch, the idea of the thing, the idea of what's happening and what that means is the most important thing. I think that goes through for an object like the hammer or the retelling, the reliving of this story and why Mr. Fisher is telling it.
Yeah, which I think is great. I'm so eager to talk to him. I'm very excited that we have the opportunity.
Yeah.
That being said, I feel like the ambiguity is something you're supposed to be left with. And I almost don't want to tie it up too neatly.
Well, and I wonder if he'll even have an answer for it, Maybe,
Now he might be.
He might have. I have.
Maybe
my
he
answer.
just wrote this book to get his neighbors off his back, and it's
much more literal. See him saying, he could say, "Hey, I have my answer," but that's not important because it's my answer. What's important is what you take out of it. I could see that. I think this is the kind of book that when you get to those last 2 pages there, I think that's what this book asks of the reader.
Yeah.
Because there is no conclusion there. It asks you to decide what you feel is important and to derive the meaning that you want to get out of it, that you think you should be taking. And it's not going to judge you either way. But what is important is the idea of the story and the story being told. And then you have to decide how important that is to you and the pieces of that you want to take with you. I think that's what gospel.
All right. One last quote I want to ask you about.
Sure.
I mean, I feel like, by the way, there were a lot of great quotes that I found myself jotting down. Everything from the, every storyteller has their purpose to, at one point we get, first of all, when the MacGuffin is introduced, the patron saint Rumpus wielded the hammer. That's the beginning of issue 2, and it's Lady Turwit talking about it, and she says, "Hearing is truth's last entry point, and a lie's first." Which I think is very interesting that our kind of villainous character is the one who's very black and white about truth and fact, and our good guys are the ones who are more mythological in their understanding of truth. They're very pre-modern.
Yeah.
And then I didn't write down who said this, but someone, I think maybe the father, said Matilda wants an easy answer to a complex problem. And trying to, diagnose what is wrong with Matilda. Why is she, what drives her, what makes her tick, what makes her move.
I think that was Father Nicholas. I think that was.
Yeah, it's Father Nicholas. And then at the end, Matilda's great last stand here is, she says, "I will sacrifice expectations for ambition, and I will sacrifice shame for pride." It sounds epic, and I was trying to figure out what it meant. Like, I kind of got caught up in it in the moment because that's her big zinger before the building blows up. And I was like, is it a sacrifice to get rid of shame in favor of pride? But I think she's making the case against martyrdom. And by the way, we didn't talk about the merits of martyrdom, because martyrdom is the easy path to being mythologized, right?
Yeah.
It's and not to shame any genuine martyrs throughout history, because Matilda says Joan of Arc didn't want to be a martyr.
Yeah.
That's good. Martyrs don't want to be martyrs.
Hold up. Even in a book like this, you can fire up West Wing season 3, technically episode 1 or episode 0, really. Isaac and Ishmael.
Yes.
President Bartlett talking to
the much maligned Isaac and Ishmael.
You know what? It's you have to view it in the idea that it was
in its context.
It was written, conceived, acted, directed, and made all within like 4 weeks of 9/11. So in the immediate aftermath, they did this there. But President Bartlett said, a martyr is someone who was willing to die for their beliefs, but would much rather live for them.
Yes.
So it's not someone who was choosing to die. It's someone who is willing to die. Because this was in the context of, someone strapping to a bomb in their chest, a suicide bomber in a religious zeal or something like that. The idea of one of those kids in this fictional high school classroom setting here is talking about, having respect for those people as martyrs. And the idea of that's not what a martyr is. It's someone who is willing to die, but not someone who wants to die. They rather live, but they are willing to die if that's what it comes down to. And so what we have here, Father Nicholas being is, he has it all twisted. This idea of, he thinks it's about the dying. It's he's mythologizing the idea of dying for the cause, whatever cause that is. He thinks that's what's important. It's wanting to die. And that's not
it's a way to hotwire fame, right? It's and it's a one final grab for power. And you think you qualify as a martyr because you're like, well, I'm laying down to protect my cause's power, but I won't be the one to have the power. So it still is a sacrificial act. And it's like, I mean, that's true. But if your cause really had the merits you are acting like it has, you would want to live for that rather than die for it.
Yes.
Which is President Bartlett's point. And then, future riffed on in Hamilton when George Washington says, dying is easy, young man. Living is harder.
Also, I think that was a line from House as well.
House MD?
MD, yeah.
Okay, I never saw it.
I think that's a line from the finale or near the end of the show, I think. But that's not an uncommon idea. The idea that dying is the easy way out. That living and wanting to live and the desire to live and to carry on, that's what takes effort and that's what takes sacrifice. And as opposed to trying to jump to the head of the line by claiming yourself as a martyr. You know, I guess that's kind of thing though, right? Part of being a martyr is that you can't declare. It's like giving yourself a nickname. You can't do that. You know, you can't. You can't do something with the intention of being a martyr. You end up a martyr because of what happened to you. You can't decide to do something to become a martyr.
Yes, the analogy. I think we're pretty apolitical show, and this is far enough back now, sadly, that I think it's public domain to talk about. But in the 2008 presidential campaign, the cringiest thing that I remember, which is there's a lot of competition in every political campaign. When John McCain picked Sarah Palin as his running mate, the media loved talking about what a rogue Republican John McCain was, because, you know, he was willing to go against party lines and, you know, do this, and this. And then as soon as Sarah Palin, as soon as Sarah Palin was on the campaign trail, she was like, oh, we're both just, you know, real roguey. We're super roguish. And I'm like, first of all, you can't do that to the word rogue in multiple senses. You can't add a Y and you can't add an ish, because something that is rogue-ish is just nothing at all. Yes. But getting beyond the mere semantics of it, you can't just self-appoint yourself a rogue in the same way you can't self-appoint yourself a martyr.
Yeah.
You look like a fool. Yeah. Trying to, because he wasn't roguish because he said that he was a rogue. Yeah. He did roguish things and was deemed a rogue by others. So that to me is the same thing. And then I think, you know, I'll just throw it out there for thought, because this is definitely where my mind went. I think there is a lot of posturing in U.S. politics and culture wars of people trying to present themselves as the martyr, you know, whether it is, I think the religious right does that quite a bit. Lots of posturing with a martyrdom complex where they're determined to be the martyrs. Anytime you see someone get canceled rightly over wildly inappropriate action, they're like, oh, this is a witch hunt, yada, yada, yada. And they try to make themselves the victim.
Look at me.
Instead of owning something they did.
Yeah. Look at me. Wrong. Look at how bad I've been treated. Look at what they've done to me.
If they do this to me, they're going to do it to you. It's like, well,
yeah. Oh yeah. No.
Not unless I, committed fraud or something. But I think it's just another interesting parallel of the villain here is someone who is trying to make themselves a martyr, trying to make themselves a myth, which is interesting that Matilda, it actually buys into that for a moment, because that's what she's been doing.
That's the same. Yes. Yeah, she is one of the same thing, which is why in the end, Father Nicholas thinks that he can bring her into it. You know, because he thinks they're on parallel tracks here. That
she's susceptible to this.
Yeah. But in the end, she sees that it's like that betrayal is so monstrous to her, and then she has loyalty in the end, you know, to Pitt, to her friends, to the village, to the people there. That means more to her ultimately than her own notoriety or fame, or you know, her own desired notoriety and fame, that in the end she can't go with him. But yeah, there's a moment there where he plays on her vanities, and I think she considers it. She thinks about it.
Well, yeah, because it seemed to be working. Like I bought that she was buying it.
Yeah, definitely.
And you know, I think now it's kind of she maybe considered it, but she was just waiting for the right time to break free.
It could be. But I don't think it'd be out of character to say that she did think about it for a second, that it did give her pause.
It would have to, based on everything you've seen, based on, you know, her setting a pig free in a pottery shop.
Yes.
Her paying someone to dress up like a donkey and light a fire. Yeah. It's like, clearly she's not morally above grabbing fame in this way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, I think there's lots of great things to talk about. And again, for a very small cast of characters, you have two modern day characters and essentially 4 characters in the past timeline for 5 issues.
Yeah.
And
we don't see a couple
secondary
characters. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, Matilda is the only character that really gets any growth. I guess maybe Pitt a little bit. We see Pitt.
Pitt probably the most. Yeah.
Oh no, I would say Matilda probably the most, because we see Pitt go from someone who is willing to trade in contraband items but not accept them himself, but he's willing to trade in them
Right.
for Jennifer, and then moves from there slightly more to, I'll actually read it now and I'm coming around to these ideas. But it wasn't like he was fervently opposed to them and then came around to it. So I think we see a little more with Matilda in terms of her understanding of story and myth and all of that. I think she turns more on that than I think anyone else. But outside of that, yeah, there isn't much else. It's not really a character study.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's not a character study. And by the way, most like mythic fairy tale type stories aren't really character stories.
Yeah.
Even if they center around a character, like Robin Hood isn't really it's not a character study in how we would think of it in modern characters. It's about the idea of a Robin Hood.
Sure. Yeah. It's not about him, the person. Yeah.
And that's just how story worked in different times and different places. Not a better or worse thing. I'm not trying to rank or pick a pecking order there, but
yeah. No, I see.
Anyway, yeah. So, but that concludes my notes, and I'm curious to see if Will Morris lands anywhere on it, and if so, where he lands and what that last page is meant to mean. But I'm happy thinking of it as a hybrid between Big Fish and Usual Suspects, both of which I think both of those movies put a finer point on the wrap up than this did. And,
definitely. Yeah. They're much more definitive.
And I think, they had broad popular appeal because of that. That being said, I think this book's done quite well. I don't look at sales numbers or anything like that. Just by kind of word of mouth and circulation, seems like a lot of people are hearing about this book, seeing it, are familiar with at least the front cover, that iconic first issue front cover.
Sure. Yeah. With the giant boar, the giant pig. Yeah. No, I think this was a book that I hadn't heard of before. I don't even recall. God, if I had even seen it on the shelf, it wouldn't have jumped out at me. Not saying that, again, the cover is stunning. It's for that first issue. But yeah, it wasn't a book that had jumped out at me until you had mentioned it. But I'm really glad I picked it up, because once I started reading it and looking at it and seeing Will Morris's art, I loved that. I love that style, and I think it's deployed really well.
Yeah. So just all kinds of great stuff here to discuss. I hope everybody listening enjoyed the book, enjoyed like prying it open in our completely unorthodox, scattered approach that we had here. But I mean, there wasn't a systematic way to pull this apart and talk about it, because it's not like, we never do story beat recap.
Yeah.
And that would be especially meaningless for a book like this.
Yeah. Because I think that's
the story beats don't cover much.
And I think that's also antithetical to what I think you and I both believe it's about. It's not about the events of the story. It's not about what happens in the story. It's about the idea of the story and what it means to keep telling it. And I think that's the meta context of what this book is trying to deliver. And that's at least what I get out of it. Whether or not that's actually what Will Morris's intent was, I don't know. But having on my subsequent rereads after that initial first one, that's what I get out of the story. That's what I get out of this comic.
Yeah, my suspicion is that he will not disabuse us of our notions of it. Even if he finds us to be incredibly mistaken.
It could be. Yeah.
Because I remember when we had posted our Seeds discussion, the Anna Senti book, David Aha listened to the podcast and tweeted back at us, and he said, basically, love your take on it. Once it leaves my desk, it's yours. It's whatever you get out of it, however you're interacting with it, it's yours now. Treat it well, basically.
I think that's a very refreshing way to look at art and art creation, to not be precious about it as a creator, to understand that I made this
basically what convinces me I shshouldn't try to create art. Because I would want so much control. I'm like, no, you're missing it. Like, don't misunderstand me.
Yeah. But no, I think, again, I think it's a very healthy way that Aha looks at his own work. And I think if more artists were like that, well, they'd probably be less tortured in general. So maybe that wouldn't work out so well. But no, I that's refreshing to hear from someone like Aha. And like I said, we'll see what Morris has to say. But I'm looking forward to talking to him.
All right. So, without any further ado, we will wrap this episode, let you skip ahead, hopefully, to next week, where you could just get to hear directly from Will Morris himself. If you haven't already, follow us on Facebook. We now sadly have had to regress back to the oldest OG social media network, which is Facebook. We have a very active page there now. We also keep an active Instagram. We are still using Twitter, but we just have no hope that will be here by the end of the year. So who knows? As long as that exists, we'll keep using it.
Yeah. So we'll be on Twitter until it
smoldering ash heap.
Yeah, it's currently a smoldering ash heap right now, but we will be on Twitter as long as the site is active.
Yeah.
How active we are on it is a different story, but we'll still use it. You can still follow us there. You can still interact with us there. You'll get updates on the stories we're working on and the books we're covering. So you can still find us there. And who knows, down the line, if we got to jump on some other social media platforms, we'll let you know. StoriedArcs.com. Keep track of us there, and you'll be able to find us elsewhere on the internet.
Yep. So we will see you next week for our exclusive interview with Will Morris, and we look forward to it.
Peace.